We've been getting a lot of correspondence over the last couple of weeks. Some of it not G-rated, some of it pretty mean, but a lot of people are asking a lot of questions. Now, we've taken out the very mean questions, we've taken out the adult-only questions, but we have got a few questions that I just think are worth answering. Some people have been asking, why did I change my position on the state of emergency legislation? And this is the strange thing, I didn't. I opposed the original structure of the bill that would have seen state of emergency legislation in Victoria being able to be extended up to 18 months. I said no to that. I said it should only ever be allowed to be extended for 6 months. And that's what I said right at the beginning, and as at the end when I voted on the legislation, it was legislation for only 6 months, for a sunset clause, so it could never last more than 6 months, and for monthly reporting back to the Parliament, where the Minister would have to provide oral briefings and answer questions. So I didn't change, it seemed everybody else did. And let's also remember, every other state in Australia has active state of emergency legislation. And in actual fact, Victoria now has some of the strictest and most conservative state of emergency legislation. In most states, governments can just keep rolling their state of emergency, and they do. But here, I argued and campaigned against a very open-ended piece of legislation for a much more restricted one. A lot of people have been saying, what was the deal you did to vote for the state of emergency legislation? And no, there was no Bitcoin involved. There was no baseball cards. I didn't swap anything. In fact, look, the script would say you didn't do a deal. In actual fact, I did do a deal. I did a deal that the state of emergency legislation would be restricted to 6 months, that there would be a sunset clause, that the Minister would have to appear before parliamentarians every month that they wanted to extend it and explain why they were extending it, answer questions. In fact, the deal I did is the legislation that exists today. If I hadn't done that deal, we would have seen very, very different legislation. You know, this is a really chaotic time. And the role of government is to try and find the calm, to try and find the path in that chaos. And small businesses have been affected by more than just about anyone else. And I have great understanding of that. You know, I've owned small businesses most of my life. I understand the pressure they're under. I speak to small businesses every day. But we need to find a pathway, and that pathway has to involve government, and it has to involve government opening up the checkbook. Now, certainly they gave some grants before, but I've been advocating for those grants to be doubled and to be opened up. And we've also got to look at the costs that the small business operators have been bearing throughout this time. And one of the main costs has been rent. But that's not just for those businesses paying rent. It's also for the landlords that haven't been able to receive rent. And I think this is an area that we need to advocate very strongly on. In fact, it's a direct subject, it's a direct area of cost that government really could assist, not just the small businesses, but the landlords who are also small businesses. There has been quite a bit of confusion around state of emergency legislation and curfews. Now, I supported the state of emergency legislation in its amended form because we need it. You know, if we want to isolate people, if we want to ensure people stay in quarantine, then we must have those provisions, just like every other state in Australia. Every state in Australia, be it Queensland, WA, Tasmania, is operating under state of emergency legislation. It enables them to provide those health restrictions. Now, curfews sit in a separate piece of legislation. In fact, they sit in what's called the state of disaster legislation. And I have been opposed to extending the curfew. When we had 700 infections, do anything you can. But now, as we're moving out, we've got to give people hope that what the sacrifices we have been making have been working. So get rid of the curfew. You know, extend the bubble for single people. Start seeing these steps out of lockdown. Now, I'm actually generally an optimistic person, and I've actually found it hard to maintain that throughout this, as I know everybody has. But I feel like I'm seeing a light at the tunnel. I feel like we are seeing a light at the tunnel, that we are nearly getting ready to open up, and that we will. And now I'm starting to think, I hope that we don't lose what we learned during this. And I hope that we look back at this and, yes, it was tough. It was horrible. You know, we have got a lot of repairing to do, but maybe we will work differently. You know, maybe we will travel differently. Maybe our kids will play differently. I think there's a bunch of stuff that this may have taught us, and that it may have taught us that we can live better, and that we can live, frankly, more locally. I've learned a lot about my local community that I'm going to cherish and enjoy post-COVID. So it's tough, but shit, it looks like we're getting to the end of it.